The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of Blackwood Mansion sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting warm light across polished marble floors and elegantly dressed guests. To everyone attending the charity luncheon that afternoon, the estate looked perfect. But appearances could lie. Near the back of the room, a pregnant woman struggled to carry a silver serving tray filled with champagne glasses. That woman was Elara Blackwood. 7 months pregnant, wife of billionaire CEO Grayson Blackwood, and at that moment not a single guest recognized her as the lady of the house. Vivienne Blackwood stood near the fireplace in a tailored Dior suit, greeting donors with practiced smiles. Whenever someone complimented the mansion, Vivienne accepted the praise proudly. Whenever someone asked about Grayson's wife, Vivienne simply changed the subject. Elara moved carefully between tables. Her lower back ached. Her ankles were swollen. The baby kicked gently beneath her simple gray uniform. A woman wearing a Cartier bracelet snapped her fingers without even looking up. "Miss, there's a stain on the floor." Elara lowered her eyes and nodded. Another guest handed over an empty glass. A third pointed toward a pile of folded napkins. No one questioned why a pregnant woman was doing the work of 3 employees. No one knew Vivienne had dismissed most of the staff for the day. No one knew Elara had been forced to take their place. Across the ballroom, Celeste Vaughan watched quietly. A strange expression crossed Celeste's face. Not satisfaction, not sympathy. Something closer to guilt. Elara bent down to pick up a dropped napkin. A sudden pain shot through her abdomen. The room spun. For a terrifying second, darkness blurred her vision. Her hand instinctively covered her stomach. "Please be okay," Elara whispered. Vivienne noticed the movement immediately. Instead of concern, irritation flashed across Vivienne's face. "Stop creating scenes and keep working." The words struck harder than the pain. At that exact moment, thousands of feet above Manhattan, a private jet cut through dark clouds. Inside the cabin, Grayson Blackwood stared at his iPhone. A meeting in San Francisco had ended early. No one knew he was coming home. And in less than 2 hours, Grayson would walk through the doors of Blackwood Mansion and discover a truth that would destroy everything he believed about his family. By the time the last guest left Blackwood Mansion, the golden glow of the afternoon had faded into a cold Manhattan evening. The ballroom was finally empty. Elara remained behind. A stack of dirty dishes waited beside the catering station. Several tables still needed cleaning. The professional staff normally assigned to these tasks had been sent home hours earlier. Vivienne had arranged that herself. Elara slowly gathered empty glasses onto a serving cart. Every movement felt heavier than the last. The baby had been unusually active all day, and a dull ache lingered in her lower back. The mansion that appeared luxurious from the outside had become a prison. 3 months earlier, Elara still believed things would improve. Three months earlier, Grayson had kissed her goodbye before leaving for another business trip. 3 months earlier, Elara had still been sleeping in the master bedroom. Now everything was different. Vivienne had moved Elara into a small guest room on the 3rd floor. The explanation had sounded reasonable. Pregnant women need quiet. The truth was much darker. The room was isolated from the rest of the house. Far from Grayson's office. Far from the family wing. Far from anyone who might notice what was happening. Elara opened the small refrigerator in the server's kitchen. Inside sat a yogurt cup and a bottle of water. That was dinner. Upstairs, a formal meal was being prepared for Vivienne and several socialite friends. The smell of roasted salmon drifted through the hallway. Elara's stomach tightened painfully, not from hunger alone, from humiliation. A framed wedding photograph stood on a nearby shelf. The Plaza Hotel, white roses, a Tiffany wedding band. A smiling Grayson holding her hand. For a moment, Elara stared at the picture. The woman in that photograph looked hopeful, loved, protected. The woman standing in the kitchen felt like a stranger. A sudden vibration interrupted her thoughts. Elara grabbed her phone. Hope immediately filled her chest. Grayson. But the screen remained dark. No message, no missed call, nothing. Unknown to Elara, every email she had sent during the past 2 months had never reached Grayson. Every plea, every cry for help, Every desperate message had disappeared before reaching its destination. And somewhere inside Blackwood Mansion, someone was making sure Grayson never learned the truth. Meanwhile, the private jet carrying Grayson Blackwood had already entered New York airspace. And fate was moving faster than anyone realized. The next morning began with rain. Dark clouds hung over Manhattan, turning the windows of Blackwood Mansion into mirrors of gray and silver. Elara barely slept. The pain from the previous day had eased, but exhaustion lingered beneath her eyes. After a quick breakfast consisting of toast and tea, Elara headed toward her prenatal appointment. For the first time in weeks, she would be outside the mansion, outside Vivian's control. Doctor Savannah Reed greeted Elara warmly inside a private medical office overlooking Central Park. The examination took longer than usual. When the results appeared on the screen, concern immediately crossed Dr. Savannah's face. Elara noticed it. "What is it?" "Doctor." Savannah carefully reviewed the report. The baby is stable, but Elara is showing signs of severe stress and nutritional deficiency. The words hit harder than expected. Elara lowered her eyes. Deep down, Elara already knew. Weeks of skipped meals, constant anxiety, endless humiliation. The emotional weight was beginning to affect both mother and child. Dr. Savannah folded her hands. Grayson needs to know what's happening. Fear instantly flashed across Elara's face. Vivian's warnings echoed in her mind. Don't embarrass the family. Don't create problems. Don't make Grayson choose. "I don't want trouble," Elara whispered. Meanwhile, back at Blackwood Mansion, another conversation was taking place. Inside Vivian's private office, Celeste Vaughn stood near a large mahogany desk. Vivian calmly handed over a tablet. Several unread emails filled the screen. Every message had been sent by Elara. Every message had been addressed to Grayson. Every message had been intercepted. Celeste looked uncomfortable. This has gone too far. Vivian's expression remained cold. Grayson needs focus, not distractions. Celeste glanced down. One message caught her attention. "Please come home. I don't know how much longer I can do this." Guilt tightened around Celeste's chest. For the first time, the situation no longer felt like a harmless favor. It felt cruel, very cruel. Hours later, Vivian received a phone call from the airport. The color drained from her face. The private jet had landed early. Grayson Blackwood was already in New York, and according to his driver, he was heading straight home. Vivian slowly lowered the phone. For the first time in months, panic appeared in her eyes, because the carefully controlled illusion inside Blackwood Mansion was about to collapse. Rain continued falling over Manhattan as a black Mercedes S-Class rolled through the gates of Blackwood Mansion. Grayson Blackwood sat quietly in the back seat, reviewing emails on a MacBook Pro. 3 exhausting weeks of meetings in San Francisco had finally come to an end. For the first time in months, Grayson was looking forward to being home. More specifically, Grayson wanted to see Elara. The driver pulled to a stop beneath the covered entrance. A butler rushed forward to open the door. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood." Grayson nodded and stepped inside. Something immediately felt wrong. The mansion was unusually quiet. No greeting from Elara, no sound of music, no sign of the warmth that usually made the massive estate feel alive. Grayson handed over a suitcase and walked deeper into the house. The silence became unsettling. Then a faint sound echoed from the grand hallway, a mop sliding across marble. Grayson frowned. Most of the staff should have finished hours ago. Following the sound, Grayson turned a corner and froze. A pregnant woman stood alone near the staircase. Gray uniform, hair tied back, rubber cleaning gloves, a bucket of dirty water beside her feet. For a moment, Grayson didn't recognize the woman. Then the woman slowly turned around. Elara. The world seemed to stop. Grayson stared in disbelief. 7 months pregnant. His wife, the woman he loved, cleaning floors like a servant. A bruise darkened one wrist. Fatigue filled her eyes. The sparkle that once defined Elara seemed almost gone. Shock flooded through Grayson. Elara. The name barely escaped. Elara looked equally stunned. Fear flashed across her face before she quickly lowered her eyes. Not relief, not happiness, fear. That reaction terrified Grayson more than anything. Before either could speak, another voice interrupted. Vivian descended the staircase, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, as if nothing unusual was happening. Vivian offered a polite smile. "Grayson, what a surprise." Grayson never looked away from Elara. "What is she doing?" Vivian answered immediately. "Helping around the house." The explanation sounded rehearsed, false. Alara's trembling hands told a different story. Then another detail caught Grayson's attention. The cleaning bucket was far too heavy. The smell of bleach filled the air, and beside the staircase sat a stack of folded uniforms. More than one, as if this had been happening for a very long time. For the first time in his life, Grayson felt something dangerous rising inside him, because the mansion suddenly looked less like a home, and more like a crime scene. The tension inside Blackwood Mansion became unbearable. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while Grayson stood frozen near the staircase. Elara remained motionless. Vivian remained calm, at least on the surface. Grayson slowly stepped toward Elara. The bruise on Alara's wrist looked even worse up close. The cleaning gloves, the swollen ankles, the exhaustion, none of it made sense. "Who did this?" Grayson asked. The question hung heavily in the air. Vivian immediately answered. "Nobody did anything." Elara insisted on helping around the house. The explanation sounded ridiculous. Grayson knew Elara. Elara hated strong cleaning chemicals. Elara was carrying their child. Elara would never choose this. Before Grayson could respond, a folded document on a nearby table caught his attention. A silver pen rested beside it. Several signatures already appeared at the bottom. Something about the scene felt wrong. Very wrong. Grayson picked up the papers. The first page instantly drained the color from his face. Confidential settlement agreement. Private residence transfer. Financial compensation. Voluntary separation. Grayson looked up. "What is this?" Vivian's expression tightened. "A private family matter." "No." Grayson's voice turned cold. "This looks like paperwork designed to make my wife disappear." For the first time, silence filled the room. Vivian's composure cracked slightly. Elara lowered her eyes. That single reaction told Grayson everything. This wasn't new. This had been happening for months. Vivian crossed her arms. "Grayson, emotions are clouding judgment." "Judgment?" Grayson held up the documents. "My pregnant wife is cleaning floors while someone prepares legal papers for her to leave." Vivian's voice sharpened. "That child has complicated this family enough." The words echoed through the hallway. Even Vivian seemed surprised they had escaped. A horrifying silence followed. Grayson stared at his mother. For a moment, the successful billionaire wasn't standing there. Only a son struggling to recognize the woman who raised him. Elara finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, painfully. "You don't need to argue anymore." Grayson turned toward Elara. Something inside him broke. There was no anger in Elara's eyes, only exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes after losing hope. "You came home too late, Grayson." The words hit harder than any accusation. Grayson wanted to argue. Wanted to promise things would change, wanted to fix everything, but one look at Elara's face made it impossible. Because Elara wasn't speaking about today. Elara was speaking about months of loneliness. Months of humiliation, months of suffering alone, and for the first time Grayson realized the greatest betrayal in the room might not be Vivian's cruelty, it might be his own absence. The hallway felt colder than ever. Grayson stood facing Elara while the silence stretched between them. For months, Grayson had imagined coming home to laughter, quiet dinners, and conversations about their future son. Instead, Grayson had returned to a nightmare. Elara slowly removed the cleaning gloves. The movement revealed small cuts on her hands, tiny wounds, but they represented something much larger. Grayson noticed every one of them. "What happened here?" Grayson asked. Elara hesitated. The answer wasn't simple. The answer wasn't one bad day. The answer was hundreds of painful moments stitched together. Vivian remained near the staircase, watching carefully, almost calculating. Elara finally looked up. Every morning started with instructions. Grayson listened. Breakfast had to be served at exactly 7. Flowers had to be arranged. Guests had to be entertained. The house had to be spotless. Each sentence struck Grayson harder. This mansion has employees. It used to. Elara's voice trembled slightly. Most were dismissed. A flashback filled Elara's mind. Long afternoons carrying laundry upstairs, cleaning guest rooms, standing through charity events despite swollen feet, serving people who believed she was hired help. The memories hurt. But another memory hurt even more. The night Elara had cried alone after feeling the baby kick for the first time. Grayson had been in Los Angeles. The message Elara sent never received a reply. Because Grayson never saw it. I tried reaching out, Elara admitted. Confusion crossed Grayson's face. What do you mean? I sent emails. I called. I left messages. Grayson's stomach tightened. Nothing had ever arrived. Not one message. Not one missed call. Something wasn't right. Something much darker was happening. Elara lowered her eyes. The hardest part wasn't the work. The statement surprised Grayson. It wasn't the insults. It wasn't the loneliness. A tear finally escaped. The hardest part was believing Grayson no longer cared. The words shattered the room. Even Vivian looked away briefly. Grayson felt physically sick. Every ignored message, every missed opportunity, every moment Elara believed she had been abandoned. None of it had been real. Someone had made sure of that. Then another voice interrupted. Celeste Vaughan appeared at the far end of the hallway. Pale, nervous, almost frightened. For several seconds, Celeste said nothing. Then Celeste looked directly at Grayson. I need to tell the truth. Vivian's face immediately changed. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in Vivian's eyes. Because Celeste was about to reveal a secret capable of destroying everything. The atmosphere inside Blackwood Mansion became suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. Grayson stared at Celeste Vaughan. Vivian stared at Celeste Vaughan. Even Elara forgot her own pain for a moment. Celeste's hands were trembling. For months, Celeste had followed Vivian's instructions without asking questions. Now the weight of those decisions had become impossible to carry. Tell Grayson, Elara whispered softly. Celeste swallowed hard. Then the truth began to spill out. The emails never disappeared by accident. A cold feeling spread through Grayson's chest. Celeste continued. Every message Elara sent was redirected. What? Grayson's voice echoed through the hallway. Celeste lowered her eyes. Vivian ordered it. Silence. Absolute silence. Grayson slowly turned toward his mother. Vivian's expression remained controlled. Too controlled. As if Vivian had prepared for this moment. Those messages were emotional manipulation, Vivian replied. Elara was creating unnecessary stress. The explanation sounded monstrous. Grayson's disbelief turned into anger. Elara stood frozen. Months of confusion suddenly made sense. Months of unanswered calls. Months of loneliness. Months of believing her husband no longer cared. Celeste reached into a leather portfolio. Several printed documents appeared. Email logs. Forwarding records. Deleted communications. Proof. Real proof. Grayson grabbed the papers. The dates matched perfectly. Every desperate message, every ultrasound update, every plea for help, intercepted, blocked, hidden. A painful memory suddenly resurfaced. 3 weeks earlier, Elara had emailed about severe abdominal pain. 2 weeks earlier, Elara had asked Grayson to come home. 10 days earlier, Elara had written a message containing only 5 words. I'm scared. Please call me. Grayson never received any of them. The realization was devastating. But Celeste wasn't finished. There is something else. Fear flashed across Vivian's face again. A different fear. A deeper fear. Celeste pulled out a small photograph. The image was old. at least 30 years old. A young woman stood in front of a coastal hotel. Around her neck hung a distinctive silver pendant, the exact pendant Elara wore every day. Elara's breath caught. The woman in the photograph was her mother. Grayson stared at the image, then at Elara, then at Vivienne. "Why do you have this?" Before Celeste could answer, Vivienne suddenly stepped forward. For the first time all evening, panic shattered Vivienne's calm mask, because the photograph wasn't just a photograph. It was connected to a secret buried for decades. A secret powerful enough to destroy the entire Blackwood legacy. Nobody in the mansion could look away from the photograph. Rain continued striking the windows as if nature itself was demanding the truth. Elara held the image with trembling fingers. The woman smiling beside the ocean was unquestionably her mother. The same eyes, the same smile. And around her neck hung the silver pendant Elara had worn since childhood. "What does this mean?" Elara asked. No one answered immediately. Vivienne's silence was more alarming than any explanation. Celeste finally took a breath. The photograph came from a storage file connected to Blackwood Harbour. Grayson frowned. Blackwood Harbour was one of the company's most valuable luxury hotel developments on the Hamptons coastline, worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What does Elara's mother have to do with that project? Celeste hesitated. Then another name entered the conversation. Nathaniel Crowe. The name instantly caught Vivienne's attention. For the first time, genuine alarm appeared in her eyes. Grayson noticed. Who was Nathaniel Crowe, and why was Vivienne suddenly afraid? Less than an hour later, the answer arrived. A black SUV pulled into the mansion driveway. Nathaniel Crowe stepped inside carrying a worn leather briefcase. The retired financial investigator looked directly at Elara, then at the pendant. Recognition immediately crossed Nathaniel's face. "My God." The words barely escaped. Elara's heart raced. Nathaniel slowly opened the briefcase. Inside sat several aging documents. Property records, investment contracts, ownership agreements. Some were over 30 years old. Nathaniel carefully placed them on a table. The woman in that photograph wasn't just an employee. A heavy silence followed. Nathaniel opened one document. The original investment agreement. Two names appeared at the bottom. One belonged to the founder of Blackwood Capital. The second name stunned everyone. Margaret Kensington, Elara's mother. Grayson stared in disbelief. "That's impossible." Nathaniel shook his head. "No." Nathaniel pointed toward the signature. Elara's mother helped finance the original hotel project. The room spun around Elara. Everything she thought she knew about her family suddenly changed. Her mother had never mentioned wealth, never mentioned investments, never mentioned ownership, because someone had erased every trace. Then Nathaniel revealed the final document, a transfer record. A suspicious transfer record. One signed shortly after Elara's mother disappeared from the project. Nathaniel looked directly at Vivienne. 30 years ago, someone stole Margaret Kensington's share of Blackwood Harbour. The room fell silent. Then Nathaniel delivered the sentence that changed everything. And legally, that ownership now belongs to Elara. The revelation exploded through the mansion like a bomb. Elara sat quietly, trying to process what Nathaniel Crowe had just revealed. A legal ownership stake. A forgotten inheritance. A fortune connected to Blackwood Harbour. None of it felt real. For 30 years, Elara's mother had been remembered as an ordinary woman struggling to survive. Now a completely different story was emerging. A story someone had worked very hard to erase. Vivienne recovered first. The shock vanished from Vivienne's face, replaced by cold determination. "This is ridiculous." Vivienne's voice cut through the room. Old documents prove nothing. Nathaniel calmly opened another folder. Actually, they prove quite a lot. Several notarized records slid across the table. Bank transfers. Investment agreements. Witness statements. The evidence was becoming impossible to deny. Grayson's jaw tightened. The deeper the investigation went, the worse it looked. Vivienne suddenly turned toward Elara. A dangerous look filled Vivienne's eyes. This is exactly why Elara entered this family. The accusation stunned everyone. Money. Ownership. Control. Elara looked shocked. Nathaniel immediately objected. Elara never knew any of this existed. But Vivian wasn't finished. Within hours, the first attack began. By midnight, several online news sites published shocking headlines. Blackwood heir's wife, connected to multi-million-dollar property claim. Mystery pregnancy at center of family dispute. Social climber or rightful heir. Elara's phone started vibrating endlessly. Comments flooded social media. Strangers judged her, insulted her, accused her of manipulating Grayson. The cruelty was overwhelming. Inside a guest suite at the Plaza Hotel where Grayson had temporarily moved Elara for safety, tears filled Elara's eyes. Not because of the headlines, because the stress was affecting the baby. Doctor Savannah had already warned them. Too much pressure could become dangerous. Grayson watched silently. Then something changed. For the first time, Grayson stopped acting like a confused husband. Grayson started acting like a protector. A MacBook sat open on the desk. The headlines reflected in Grayson's eyes. Every article traced back to the same source. Someone inside Blackwood Holdings. Someone close to Vivian. Then Nathaniel's phone. The retired investigator answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But when Nathaniel ended the call, the color had drained from Nathaniel's face. What happened? Grayson asked. Nathaniel looked directly at Grayson. A former Blackwood employee wants to talk. Who? Nathaniel took a slow breath. The person claims to have witnessed everything 30 years ago. The room fell silent. Because if that witness was telling the truth, Vivian Blackwood's entire empire was about to collapse. The meeting took place the next morning inside a private conference room at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan. Outside, reporters crowded the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Elara sat beside Grayson while Nathaniel prepared several folders on the polished table. Nobody knew what to expect. The witness had insisted on secrecy. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. An elderly man slowly entered the room. His name was Walter Hayes, 81 years old, former accountant for Blackwood Harbor. The moment Nathaniel introduced him, Vivian's face lost all color. Grayson noticed immediately. Walter wasn't just a witness. Walter was someone Vivian feared. Walter carefully placed a small metal box on the table. The box looked old. Very old. The kind of object that had been hidden for decades. Nathaniel opened it. Inside sat dozens of documents. Original contracts, financial ledgers, private correspondence. Records that should have existed in company archives. Records that had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Walter adjusted his glasses. I kept copies. The room fell silent. Walter explained everything. 30 years earlier, Elara's mother had invested money into the struggling harbor project. The investment saved the development from bankruptcy. Without that money, Blackwood Harbor would never have existed. But shortly after the project became profitable, ownership records were altered, names vanished, signatures were replaced, assets changed hands. Walter looked directly at Grayson. The changes weren't approved by the investors. Grayson already knew the answer, but Grayson asked anyway. Who ordered it? Walter's eyes slowly turned toward Vivian. Vivian Blackwood. The words landed like thunder. Elara closed her eyes. Nathaniel lowered his head. Even Grayson looked shaken. But Walter wasn't finished. Another document emerged from the box. A handwritten statement signed by Grayson's late father. The statement contained a confession. The original ownership transfer had been fraudulent. The guilt had haunted him for years. Shock spread through the room. Vivian suddenly stood. This proves nothing. But the confidence was gone, the control was gone, the power was gone. Nathaniel quietly slid one final item across the table, a USB drive. Walter's hands trembled. I never wanted anyone to see this. Grayson stared at the device. What is it? Walter swallowed. A video recorded by your father 3 weeks before his death. No one spoke. Because everyone understood. If the video contained a confession, the Blackwood scandal was about to become impossible to hide. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The small USB drive sitting on the conference table suddenly felt more valuable than every Blackwood asset combined. Grayson slowly picked it up. Walter Hayes looked exhausted. Nathaniel looked tense. Elara felt her heart racing. Across Manhattan, inside Blackwood Holdings Tower on Park Avenue, an emergency board meeting had already been scheduled. The directors wanted answers. Immediately. Before anyone could leave the room, Grayson connected the USB drive to a MacBook. The screen flickered. A video appeared. The recording quality was poor. The man on the screen looked older and weaker than Grayson remembered. It was his father, Richard Blackwood. 3 weeks before his death. For several seconds, Richard simply stared into the camera. Then Richard began speaking. "If anyone is watching this, it means I waited too long." The room fell silent. Richard admitted everything. The original harbor project had nearly failed. Elara's mother had invested money when nobody else would. Margaret Kensington had risked everything. Without her help, the company would have collapsed. Tears filled Elara's eyes. The next words were even worse. Richard confessed that ownership documents had later been altered. Pressure had come from Vivian. Arguments had followed. Threats had followed. Eventually, Richard had remained silent. The guilt never disappeared. "I betrayed someone who trusted me." The confession echoed through the room. Nathaniel lowered his head. Walter closed his eyes. Grayson felt physically sick. For years, Grayson had admired his father's legacy. Now that legacy looked very different. The video continued. "If Margaret Kensington's family ever finds this recording, they deserve the truth." Then came the final bombshell. Richard revealed the existence of a private trust, a trust established before the ownership transfer occurred, a trust worth hundreds of millions, a trust legally connected to the original investors, including Margaret Kensington. Shock spread through the room. Elara could barely process it. But fate wasn't finished. At that exact moment, Elara suddenly grabbed the edge of the table. Pain shot through her abdomen. A sharp pain. A terrifying pain. Grayson immediately rushed forward. Elara's face turned pale. Dr. Savannah's warning echoed in everyone's mind. Too much stress could become dangerous. Nathaniel reached for a phone. Walter stood in panic. And as another painful contraction hit, everyone realized the truth. The battle for justice had reached its most important moment, because Elara wasn't the only one fighting anymore. Now her unborn son was fighting too. Everything happened at once. One moment, Elara was sitting inside the conference room. The next moment, Grayson was rushing her through the emergency entrance of New York Presbyterian Hospital. Doctors and nurses immediately surrounded the stretcher. The bright lights above blurred together as Elara struggled to stay calm. Fear filled every corner of the room. Not fear for herself. Fear for her baby. Dr. Savannah Reed arrived only minutes later. The concern on Dr. Savannah's face frightened Grayson more than any words could. Stress triggered early labor. The diagnosis hit hard. Hours passed. The storm outside Manhattan intensified. Rain hammered against hospital windows, while Grayson remained beside Elara's bed. For the first time in months, Grayson wasn't thinking about board meetings. Not about Blackwood Harbor. Not about scandals. Only Elara. Only their son. Elara looked exhausted. Yet something surprising happened. Instead of blaming Grayson, Elara reached for his hand. The gesture nearly broke him. Grayson remembered every missed message, every ignored warning, every moment Elara had suffered alone. The guilt felt unbearable. "I should have come home sooner." The words escaped quietly. Elara closed tired eyes. "Then don't leave again when things become difficult." The sentence carried more meaning than an entire speech. Grayson nodded immediately. For the first time, no promises about money were made. No promises about power. Only presence. Only commitment. Hours later, another complication appeared. The baby's heartbeat suddenly dropped. The room exploded into action. Doctors rushed inside. Machines began sounding alarms. Grayson felt completely helpless. Elara's face turned pale. For several terrifying minutes, nobody knew what would happen. Outside the delivery room, Nathaniel sat silently. Walter prayed. Even Celeste waited nervously. Meanwhile, far across Manhattan, Vivian sat alone inside Blackwood Mansion. For the first time in decades, Vivian had no control over events, no influence, no power, only uncertainty. Back at the hospital, Dr. Savannah worked quickly. The tension became unbearable. Then suddenly, a cry, small, weak, beautiful. The sound froze everyone. A newborn baby's cry filled the room. Tears immediately streamed down Elara's face. Grayson closed his eyes in relief. Their son had arrived. Orion Blackwood was alive, healthy, safe. For a brief moment, it felt like the nightmare was finally ending. But while nurses completed routine paperwork, an unexpected document appeared in Orion's medical file, a document connected to an old family trust. And what it revealed would shock everyone far more than the birth itself. The morning after Orion's birth felt strangely peaceful. Sunlight poured through the hospital windows. For the first time in months, Elara slept without fear. Orion rested safely beside her. Every tiny breath felt like a miracle. Grayson remained in the room, unwilling to leave even for a few minutes. The events of the previous weeks had changed everything, but another surprise was waiting. Shortly after noon, Nathaniel Crowe arrived carrying a thick folder. The retired investigator looked more serious than ever. Something came back from the trust attorneys. Grayson immediately stood. Elara's attention shifted toward the folder. Nathaniel placed several documents on a nearby table. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Margaret Kensington, Elara's mother, the forgotten investor, the woman history had erased. Nathaniel carefully explained what investigators had discovered overnight. 30 years earlier, before ownership records were altered, a protected family trust had been established. The trust was designed to preserve the original investors' interests. No board member could change it, no executive could erase it, not even Vivian. The trust had remained hidden because nobody knew it still existed. Until now. Nathaniel opened the final document. The room became silent. The primary beneficiary has been identified. Elara expected her own name. Instead, Nathaniel pointed to another line. Orion Blackwood. Shock filled the room. Grayson blinked twice. Elara looked completely stunned. The legal language was clear. Because Orion was the first direct descendant of Margaret Kensington's bloodline, the trust automatically transferred to him at birth. The value exceeded $800 million. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Elara began crying. Not because of the money, because her mother had been vindicated. Finally, completely. The truth could no longer be hidden. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, an emergency board meeting was taking place at Blackwood Holdings. Directors had reviewed Richard Blackwood's confession, the evidence, the witness testimony, the altered records. The vote was unanimous. Vivian Blackwood was removed from every leadership position, effective immediately. When security escorted Vivian from the building, dozens of employees watched silently. No applause, no celebration, only consequences. For the first time in decades, Vivian had to face the results of her own actions. Back at the hospital, Grayson gently lifted Orion into his arms. The baby opened sleepy eyes. Nathaniel smiled softly. The truth finally found its way home. But another surprise was waiting. Because investigators had just uncovered one final piece of evidence against Vivian. And it was far worse than anyone imagined. 3 weeks later, the story dominated every major business headline in America. The fall of Vivian Blackwood had become impossible to ignore. News networks discussed the scandal daily. Financial analysts questioned how such a powerful woman had hidden the truth for so long. But for Elara, none of that mattered anymore. Elara spent most days at home with Orion. The small apartment overlooking the Hudson River felt more peaceful than the mansion ever had. For the first time in years, life felt safe. Meanwhile, Vivian's world continued collapsing. The final investigation report had been released. The missing documents, the altered ownership records, the intercepted communications, the campaign against Elara. Everything had been proven. One by one, former allies disappeared. Charity boards requested resignations. Business partners ended relationships. Social invitations stopped arriving. The same elite circles that once admired Vivian now avoided her completely. The punishment was not prison. The punishment was isolation. One rainy evening, Vivian sat alone inside a luxury penthouse overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly below. Yet the apartment felt empty. The silence felt unbearable. A framed family photograph rested on a nearby shelf. Grayson, Richard, a younger version of herself. Vivian stared at the picture for a long time. For the first time, there was nobody left to blame. Not Elara, not Nathaniel, not the media, only herself. Across town, another surprise surfaced. Investigators discovered additional recordings from Richard Blackwood's private archive. The recordings revealed that Richard had repeatedly begged Vivian to restore Margaret Kensington's ownership rights. Vivian had refused every time. The revelation destroyed any remaining public sympathy. The consequences became final. Days later, a certified envelope arrived at Elara's apartment. Grayson handed it over carefully. Elara opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The signature immediately caught her attention. Vivian Blackwood. The letter wasn't a threat. It wasn't a legal demand. It was an apology. A genuine apology. Vivian admitted jealousy, fear, pride, mistakes. The words felt strangely human. Elara quietly folded the letter. Forgiveness wouldn't come easily. Some wounds were too deep, but hatred no longer controlled the future. As the sun began setting over Manhattan, Grayson looked toward Elara and Orion. For the first time, the darkness behind them seemed smaller than the life ahead, and 1 year later, something beautiful was waiting for all of them. 1 year later, the ocean sparkled beneath a clear Hamptons sky. The newly restored Blackwood Harbor stood proudly along the shoreline, but the name above the entrance was no longer the same. Large bronze letters now read, "The Kensington Legacy Center." People gathered from across New York to attend the grand opening. Students, local families, business leaders, former hotel employees. For many, it was more than a ceremony. It was justice. At the center of the crowd stood Elara. A soft breeze moved through Elara's hair as Orion rested comfortably in her arms. The little boy's laughter drew smiles from everyone nearby. A year earlier, Elara had been cleaning floors inside a mansion where she wasn't treated like family. Today, Elara stood as the woman who restored her mother's name, not through revenge, through truth. Nearby, Nathaniel Crowe carefully approached, carrying a small wooden box. The retired investigator smiled. This belonged to Margaret Kensington. Elara slowly opened the box. Inside rested an old pocket watch. A simple engraving covered the inside lid. The truth always returns. Tears immediately filled Elara's eyes. For a moment, it felt as though her mother was standing beside her, watching, proud. The ceremony began. Scholarships were announced for working families. Educational grants were established. Hospitality programs were funded in Margaret Kensington's honor. The woman history tried to erase would now help thousands of people build better futures. That was the real victory. Not money, not ownership, legacy. A few moments later, Grayson approached. The past year had changed Grayson completely. No grand speeches followed, no promises of wealth, only honesty. Grayson knelt on one knee. The crowd quietly watched. A small ring box appeared, not because Grayson wanted a second wedding, because Grayson wanted a second chance. Elara deserves the choice that should have existed from the beginning. Emotion filled Elara's eyes. Orion giggled and reached toward Grayson. Laughter spread through the crowd. Then Elara smiled. The same smile Grayson thought had been lost forever. Yes. Applause erupted across the harbor. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the ocean, 3 generations finally found peace. Margaret Kensington's truth had survived. Orion's future was secure. Grayson and Elara had rebuilt their family. And somewhere beyond the waves, it felt as though justice had finally come home. And so this story comes to an end. But my dear friends, if you're still here with me right now, then maybe something in Elara's journey touched your heart in a very personal way. Maybe it wasn't the mansion, the money, or the family secrets. Maybe it was the feeling of being misunderstood. the feeling of carrying pain in silence while the world sees something completely different. And if that's true, then perhaps the most important lesson from this story is that truth may be delayed, but it is rarely defeated forever. The ancient Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." That doesn't mean life will always be fair. It means that even when others try to take away your dignity, your value does not disappear. Elara lost comfort, status, and security, but she never lost her character. In the end, that became her greatest strength. Life has a way of testing people. Sometimes justice arrives quickly, sometimes it takes years. But kindness, integrity, and perseverance leave a mark that time cannot erase. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this one. And before you go, remember this: no matter how long the darkness lasts, the truth always finds its way home. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next story. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment, inspiration, and storytelling purposes. The characters, events, organizations, locations, and situations portrayed in this video are fictional or creatively adapted and should not be interpreted as real-life allegations, accusations, or factual representations of any individual, company, or institution. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or real events is purely coincidental. The themes explored in this story, including family conflict, forgiveness, personal growth, resilience, and justice, are intended to encourage reflection and meaningful discussion. While certain locations, brands, or public settings may be referenced to create a realistic atmosphere, they are used only as narrative elements and do not imply endorsement, sponsorship, affiliation, or involvement in the events of the story. Viewer discretion and personal interpretation are encouraged. The purpose of this content is to share emotional storytelling, life lessons, and messages of hope, perseverance, and healing.